Hey folks, welcome back to the old Daisy Dirty Workshop here. This is Russ and I'm having more Daisy Lever Gun fun because today I want to talk about springs, the mainsprings inside so many of our Daisy Lever Guns. And these are common. I mean, the basic design of these things is the same with some modifications for almost every one of these things you pick up. The 111s, the 111 Model 40s, the 102s, the Model 36, the 1938s and 38Bs, the Model 105 Bucks. They all have something similar like this inside of them, and many others. The wide frame daisies, that whole 90 series, the 95s, the 90, well, you know what I'm talking about, the 96s, the 99. They all have some variation of mainspring on a driver that runs the piston head and gives us our power in the form of air pressure that goes out through that front tube. So one of the things that people often say is you should never ever leave your gun cocked because that puts pressure on the spring. Well, yes and no. It does put pressure on the spring, but it's only adding more pressure to the compression the spring is already suffering with. And I'm going to explain what I mean about this. Here's some examples of springs I've taken off of other guns. This one is sort of straight, probably could get reused for a while. This one is one of the older guns. I don't know if you can see this real well. It's steel, but it has a copper wash on it. And as I turn it, you can see there are some radical kinks in it from, radical kinks from the way this thing was set and perhaps not tempered evenly all the way through. Here's one that's a little bit different. It has a different amount of coils in it, and it's succumbed to a lot of twisting and warping. Here's one here that you can see it in here. You can see it at the end. Here's a big hump on there. There's just so much that these springs have to put up with in their life. It's no wonder they have an issue. And one of the issues that they have is the fact that they don't get a chance to relax all the way. Once the gun is assembled, these things are always in a state of compression, whether the gun is cocked or not. And I'm going to tell you why. If you look at just an average spring, you see how it appears to be longer? All the springs are a bit longer because you have to have a certain amount of pressure to hold everything in place. So whenever you go to assemble this, let's say you have this piece out, you have the plunger assembly out, and you wanted to pull the pin, or you wanted to replace the compression cup, the seal on the front, you have to compress that spring to be able to work on everything above it. And then when it's assembled, you take the tension off, and there you go. And it works the same way, even though this is one of the older leather ones. Even though that pin is not holding the spring back, it is holding the metal part of this leather plunger keeper. And so it holds, the tension holds everything in place on that little pin that only runs through the radius of the assembly, not all the way past the spring. You see? You see that? Okay. Now that's one thing. Then again, when you go to assemble the gun, what do you have to do? You have to put in the spring retainer. If we look at a Red Ryder, for instance, I'll just pull this one up off here. You see this? This is the top of a spring retainer. And they come in different styles, okay? But if you put this in, whenever you put this together, because you have to have it spaced so that the lever is able to catch the back edge of this inside, it ends right about here. The front of this pushes against the abutment, and this ends back here. Well, if it ends back there, you can see the spring goes out past the spring retainer. What you have to do is compress that spring a little more. And I use a tool, some like one of the, here's a couple I just pulled off the bench here. You get in there, you push the tool against this, and you shove the spring that much further ahead, up to where the spring retainer goes. It doesn't go between the coils, it goes on the end of the coil, but the coil has to be compressed that much further. So now you've taken a spring that's this long, you've compressed it to this size, you're compressing it again that much further, and the spring is in its so-called resting state at that point. Okay? Moving it up to here, you've already compressed it, that's resting. When you go to cock the gun, guess what? The way the lever on that particular gun I showed you works, it's going to take this spring and it's going to keep it in place with that spring retainer, and the shaft is going to move back an additional 2 inches. That's the additional pressure against this piston assembly caused by the potential of that spring. Whenever you pull the trigger, it goes back to that state where this is only resting back that far against the spring retainer, and that's where it rests. There's always pressure against that spring. And what makes it even worse sometimes is what I know what I've done, what a lot of fellows have done, just to make things a little more powerful, because you want to get as much potential out of that spring as possible. You put a preloader in. You'll take a piece of copper tubing, maybe a 1/2 inch or so long, or a piece of steel tubing, and you'll put it in behind that spring to compress it a little bit more. But don't forget, if you go too far with it, you're not going to be able to cock the gun, because there's only so much space in between all of these coils. The more of that space you take up, the less space you have to make up that last 2 inches whenever you're cocking the gun. Now, the spring retainers come in different styles. Here's one here I probably pulled out of, a Red Ryder, because I think that's what they look like. Here's one from an older 111B. It has that little cradle on top. Or not a 111B, I'm sorry, a 11140. Here's a couple that I took out of 2 different guns that didn't have the mounted sight. They use the spring retainer for a rear sight. Here's one with a V-notch, and here's one just with a straight notch in it. And you could tell the straight notch is a little bit longer. So it just depends on what gun they come out of to see what's going to fit again going back in. Well, there it is, folks, for today. We're just talking springs here, and springs have different tensions. Not all of them have the same quality of tempering, and some of them are treated differently. Some people abuse their guns, and if you abuse the gun, you're abusing the parts inside as well as the outside sometimes. So let me know what you think. If you get a chance, would like you to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, leave comments, tell me if you've ever run into some really weird things with your springs also. This is Russ. We'll talk to you next time soon. Have a good one.